Well, thank you for coming back from our lunch. I hope you are sufficiently restored with energy and enough food and drinks to face our afternoon. And our afternoon is divided into roughly two parts. We start, and I also welcome very warmly Katri Huutoniemi, who's come to deliver one of our keynotes and was very kind to accept our invitation. We met her in Finland at a workshop on interdisciplinarity, which was organized by our colleague, but also we actually had already read her work and we were very keen to get to know her. So we really welcome her and to deliver advancing knowledge through interdisciplinarity. And after the break, we will then break up into some working groups that will be managed and masterminded by Henrik and his team. So I welcome you, and please take the floor. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for the invitation to come here. And I'm really sorry that I couldn't make it here in the morning. I look forward to learn more about the INTREPID cost action, what is this about, and who are you? But my name is Katri Huutoniemi. I come from the Academy of Finland now. So when I was invited to come here, I was a researcher at the University of Helsinki, and I made my dissertation about interdisciplinarity and its evaluation. But now I have been 2 months working as a science advisor in the Academy of Finland in the Planning and Management Support Unit. And I never really checked with Olivia what was expected from me here and what was the meaning of the title that was given to me, interdisciplinary policy funding or something like that. Yes. So I just take the liberty to modify the title a little bit, so it's now Advancing Knowledge Through Interdisciplinarity. And I would say that I look at the topic more like a researcher's perspective rather than research funder's perspective. But I'm not really a practicing interdisciplinary researcher myself, but rather an outsider analyst of interdisciplinarity. So my background is in environmental science, but recently science and technology studies. So science is the object of my analysis. Where should I point this?
No, it should be. No. It worked before.
Yeah.
Okay, I can
Did
use that.
someone take out the? No, it's here.
What one?
No, it's here.
I can use the just the arrows. Okay.
But it was just a test.
Is it switched on?
This thing. Oh. Aha. No. It should work now. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, right.
It was off.
Thank you.
Thank you. That usually is a question that I find very insulting, but for this time, it was off.
So the purpose of my talk is to discuss the ways in which interdisciplinarity can advance or cannot advance scientific knowledge. And I really mean scientific knowledge in general and not just in particular projects or cases, even though we have to look at particular cases to say anything about science, but I'm interested in science as an entire social system. And I will talk about the added values of interdisciplinarity, and here I don't mean really value for money or value for the national innovation system or something like that, but rather a kind of epistemic value, like in what respects can interdisciplinarity improve science as a system, as a social system of knowledge production. And I will illustrate my considerations of value by looking at interdisciplinarity in a few funding schemes from Finland, and these schemes do not really constitute a coherent or logical whole in the sense that I would have compared them in any systematic way, but I have just done individual consultancies and different kinds of analysis of these schemes, and now I'm trying to say something what I have learned about interdisciplinarity by looking at these funding instruments. And I'll conclude my talk by raising some, I think, important questions about the place of interdisciplinarity in science policy. By the way, how long are you expecting to, I mean, we have...
We said 30, 40 minutes and then discussion, it's up to you, but it can be shorter and we have more discussion time.
Right. So, just a few words about the background and orientation. So, why I think we should be interested in the added values of interdisciplinarity. So, I guess you agree that there is an obvious need for both methodological and science policy advice. Interdisciplinarity is very high at science policy agendas, but still we are struggling with some basic issues like what is good interdisciplinary research. There is a long tradition of conceptual and normative discussion of this question, but not too much systematic analysis that combines both a theoretical understanding of science and knowledge and also empirical work on scientific practices and what is possible and desirable to do in science. And there are also multiple definitions of interdisciplinarity. I heard that you have talked the whole morning about these definitions. And if there is a consensus about this meaning, I think the consensus is that there are multiple meanings, no single definition. And therefore there must be also multiple criteria for good interdisciplinarity. But I don't think this is necessarily very helpful for science policy purposes. We already have a number of disciplines that are very different to compare in terms of their value. And now if we also have different types of interdisciplinarity, we have a very difficult to make science policy decisions about what to prioritize and when. And we really need some kind of advice. We need to know why, when, and how we should support interdisciplinarity. But at the same time, I also think that we need very critical examination of the concept of interdisciplinarity because it's so frequently used buzzword in different contexts and sometimes doesn't mean almost anything. Here's a glance at the conceptual and empirical resources that I've been using in my work. I have reviewed the existing definitions and classifications of interdisciplinarity, and it's actually a vast literature. I don't know how many of you are really involved in that, but sometimes I feel that we are reinventing the wheel because there's so much already, and well, Julie Klein is one of the persons who have really gathered everything together and tried to make this discussion a more cumulative effort. But I think we must look at what has been done in the recent decades in terms of the concept. But I have also tried to put these concepts into practice and use them in empirical work. So I have analyzed the content of research proposals. And I have also made interviews with researchers who do interdisciplinary work and try to understand the research process by using the concepts from the literature. But I also think that interdisciplinarity should be understood and defined in the broader institutional context of science. So we must understand quite a lot about disciplines, for example, and what is a methodology, in order to know what kind of difference interdisciplinarity actually makes there. And one important institution is peer review, because, or not least because it's sometimes or often claimed that it's one of the major obstacles for interdisciplinary research. And therefore I have made some detailed empirical work on peer review deliberation in collective evaluation panels, and also looked at the contents of peer review judgments in order to understand how they actually evaluate the quality of interdisciplinary work. But even science and the institutions of science, I think, should be put in the still broader context, because science is part of society, which is part of the living world. So I think these relationships are very important. And in this very broad context, we see that science is a historical entity that is itself a kind of evolving social system. And ultimately, I think that we could understand science as an instrument for human flourishment and sustainability. So the values of the epistemic values of science really come from there, in my mind. And I have recently become less interested in the specificities of interdisciplinarity and more interested in interdisciplinarity as an integral part of science, and perhaps also a useful window or angle to the whole system of knowledge production. So I really believe that interdisciplinarity adds value to science. But sometimes I think that the practicing interdisciplinary scientists are not necessarily the right persons to talk about those values because they are so close. So on the one hand, there are those who take the added values of interdisciplinarity for granted and they advertise their work as more comprehensive and more responsive and more democratic than disciplinary research. But they are not always very aware about what actually disciplines are and in what sense interdisciplinarity is really better and how useful and necessary disciplines really are. But then there are also the other group of practitioners who do not necessarily claim any added values, but they just want to do their own stuff and they are worried about the institutions like peer review that are not fair. I mean that the kind of possibilities for doing interdisciplinarity are not equal to those compared to them who do disciplinary work. But I think both of these positions they are not enough. So we also need a more distant view, and when we talk about these added values. And I agree that the system is not always fair to interdisciplinary researchers, but my main concern is really that there is not enough attention to the goals of science as a whole and whether the whole science is going into a desirable direction. And I believe that the biggest values of interdisciplinarity actually have to do with that question. So given this kind of positive contribution in mind, I actually would like to propose that we have a functional definition of interdisciplinarity. So as opposed to descriptive definitions that try to describe what kind of thing interdisciplinarity is like, I would propose that we actually try to define interdisciplinarity through its function. And as I see the function, interdisciplinarity is a means of advancing knowledge beyond a single discipline. And this definition requires that interdisciplinarity is explicitly understood with relation to disciplinary research. So whereas the disciplinary research, the function of disciplinary research is to contribute new knowledge to the discipline or some discipline, the function of interdisciplinarity is to go somehow beyond that. And this going beyond can be valuable both for epistemic or intellectual reasons, but also for societal or practical reasons. But when we talk about values, they cannot be defined without thinking about some group of beneficiaries who actually who get kind of experience the values. So sometimes the values of interdisciplinarity are defined primarily for the project partners themselves, and sometimes for some entire disciplines perhaps, or the funding organization or specific political programs, and even more frequently now for knowledge users. And I think this variability of beneficiaries and the values are quite well addressed by interdisciplinary researchers compared to disciplinary researchers who are not always good at understanding their work as something that benefits some particular groups outside of the science itself. But what is not so much or not so explicitly discussed is that promoting particular values always have some systemic effects elsewhere. So there are also other consequences than those promoting those particular values. And if we promote one direction of research, it can easily mean slowing down another direction of research. Or if we try to tailor knowledge for a specific user group, it's easily the consequence that some other groups cannot use the knowledge so easily. So this is what I mean by systemic effects. And therefore I would like to take a step back from this overly pluralistic view of interdisciplinary values and ask what are the generic values of interdisciplinarity, or are there some kind of virtues that are virtues in interdisciplinarity that are helpful or beneficial for all somehow. And looking at the literature and the discussion, I think there are three generic epistemic values in interdisciplinarity that are breadth, integration, and transformation. I have defined those terms myself, but I guess the most common value of interdisciplinarity is perhaps this breadth of subject matter, breadth of vision or skills. And breadth is useful because it enables the flow of ideas and intellectual exchange across fields, which is usually understood beneficial or valuable. And it's also known that the breadth of vision facilitates both intellectual development and problem solving. But interdisciplinarity is not just about the breadth of perspectives, but also making connections between different disciplines. So integration or synthesis is typically another key value of interdisciplinarity. And also this property is believed to generate greater insights and more comprehensive solutions to real world problems. And still another value is what I would call transformation or the capacity to transcend the existing structures of knowledge and including the status quo. So interdisciplinarity is a kind of regenerative force that liberates us from the kind of existing worldviews. And this property can facilitate especially the critical goals of knowledge and also work as a source of radical innovation and breakthrough. And these three values are often associated with the three major types or classes of boundary crossing work: these multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. And that's okay, but I think that the discussion on these categories has somehow dominated too much our thinking, and we are kind of worrying too much where are the boundaries between two categories and not focusing always the purpose and value behind doing these types of work. So I would rather think of these as values than categories. And these values actually, I think, they span the categories. Like interdisciplinarity is usually not just integration, but it's also breadth or diversity, and it's also transformative. So they span the categories. I just wish to quickly illustrate to you that these values can really influence on how interdisciplinarity is measured. So, okay, if we think that breadth is important, then the scientometric people talk about diversity in this case. and diversity can increase when the number of disciplines increase, when the balance between disciplines increases, or when the cognitive distance between the participating disciplines increases. Whereas integration refers to coherence. It is about the number of relations or the intensity of relations and so on. And the transformation is still another property. If you try to measure it, it's like it's a structural change, it's a dynamic property. It's much more difficult to measure than the other two. But anyway, we see that at this concrete level of measurement, these values have quite different implications for research evaluation, for example. And yeah, I have 10 minutes time, or 9 minutes. I had an idea to talk about these funding schemes.
I can tell you at 5 when you have 5 more. Yeah.
5 more.
Do you want me to tell you when it's less than 5 minutes?
Okay, yeah. So I have in different times for different purposes look at these funding instruments from the perspective of interdisciplinarity. So the Academy of Finland, which is a national funding organization in Finland, funding basic research primarily. They have a funding instrument called Academic Project, which is a bottom-up type of funding instrument. And I have analyzed that in one occasion. And then I have also looked at the research program in computational science, which is a typical thematic 4-year funding for specific purpose. And then environmental research that is funded by Helsinki University Center for Environment. They have also 4-year programs that aim to be interdisciplinary. And maybe I don't mention the 4th case because it's not realistic yet, but well, there's Lappeenranta University of Technology that is undergoing a structural change into a really interdisciplinary university. And this is a future study that is really at the beginning stage now. Okay, so all these funding instruments have slightly different purposes, and the Academy Project is a kind of baseline scenario in the sense that they fund bottom-up research, that there are no particular incentives for interdisciplinarity. The goal is just to promote quality and diversity of research and so on. But the computational science program and these environmental programs have interdisciplinarity explicitly mentioned in the funding criteria. And just to quickly show some findings from these schemes. So this academic project, we wanted to look how much of the funded projects were actually interdisciplinary. And this is the old stuff we have published 2010, but also 2005 was the original report. But anyway, we found that as much as almost a little bit more than 40% were somehow interdisciplinary. Most of it was a narrow scope between closely related research fields, and 1/3 of the interdisciplinarity was of broad scope. And then we also looked into the data set that was interdisciplinary somehow, and looked at the multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary proportions, and found that actually more than half were interdisciplinary in an integrative sense, whereas multidisciplinary in a coordinative sense was not that popular. And we also looked at the goals, what kind of goals, why interdisciplinary was taken as a principle there, and most of the work was had epistemic type of goals, like advancing knowledge, not necessarily solving any practical problems. I think this is quite interesting in the sense that the number of the degree of interdisciplinarity is that high, even though there are no particular incentives for interdisciplinarity. Then I looked in this funding scheme. I looked at the functions of interdisciplinary collaboration. I made a survey and interviews with the researchers and tried to understand what exactly was the scientific rationale for doing interdisciplinarity. And I found different types that I would call problem solving, conceptual, bridging, and exploration. So maybe I don't go into them now, but the point is that these functions are kind of very close to the basic functions of science in general. And interdisciplinarity can often boost these functions instead of being some kind of added property or extra different thing. It's really into the core. The scientific goals themselves are such that interdisciplinarity can help achieving them. And here in the environmental research programs, I looked at because the purpose of the program was explicitly to bridge natural and social sciences, and I wanted to look at what kind of relationships between the disciplines were actually designed into the project. And I also made interviews here, and I found different kinds of ways of combining disciplines, and these concepts are from the literature, but I found them very useful to make sense of what happens in these projects. And this integrative synthetic mode is typically the ideal type. It's thought that that should be the purpose, and that's the desirable goal. But then what actually happens in most projects is that this is not, at least in a 4-year period, it's not achieved, and something else happens. And I would call those other two types subordination service and agonistic antagonistic, because these are the terms that are used in the literature. But anyway, integration is not, there's not necessarily a common problem space, but there can be a kind of hierarchical structure that the whole is more defined by one discipline, and some other disciplines are kind of giving services to the dominating discipline, and this works pretty well. Very useful results are coming out of these studies, and I don't see why it should be kind of not so valuable. And also this agonistic antagonistic mode, it refers to the situation where not really integration happens, but the useful dialogue and communication, which is helpful as such. It promotes learning and perhaps also this formation. Yeah. So what could perhaps be learned from these cases is that, well, researchers might learn that successful interdisciplinary collaboration does not necessarily require common understanding of problems, but there can be kind of parallel problems that are studied in somehow a related manner, and they can feed to each other processes, and it's already interdisciplinary because there is interaction between the disciplines. And also that the disciplinary perspectives do not need to be 50-50 equal, like the power distribution, that everyone can contribute in the same, exactly in the same way, because there can be hierarchical structures, and some discipline is giving a tiny piece for other, and it's still interdisciplinary because there is interaction. And well, research funders, I would say that sometimes it's a requirement of interdisciplinary collaboration may also force researchers to go back to their boxes and try to profile their expertise in more disciplinary terms, because they have to show to the world that this is an interdisciplinary combination. And that's a kind of unintended consequences of requiring breadth or disciplinary diversity. And another lesson perhaps is that well, in these environmental programs there was a strong emphasis on problem solving, but it can easily result into incremental solutions to existing problems instead of trying to think more big way and perhaps expand the problem space itself. So I'm also a little worried about this kind of solution, too much solution, too big solution oriented attitude. And also it was pretty clear from these environmental programs that this strongly top-down managed collaboration rarely works, because only the researchers can really know where are the relevant connections between their research agendas. It cannot be seen from the outside. I'll jump to the final slide. So what I've tried to tell you is that I think these interdisciplinary values resonate very well with the overall goals of science. They are not something specific, but they are really in the core of all research work. And I think it's hard to understand the benefits of interdisciplinarity without understanding also how the system of science as a whole works. And seen from this systemic perspective, I think that the interdisciplinarity provides remedies for the undesired developments in science, like the fragmentation of knowledge into tiny pieces that do not communicate. It's kind of self-sufficiency, like looking only into our own problems and not responding to broader concerns, and being kind of too narrowly focusing on tiny pieces. So in this sense, I would say that perhaps interdisciplinarity is a kind of virtue in science that should be cultivated kind of systematically, routinely, everywhere. But I would also raise some questions like, is interdisciplinary research more valuable than disciplinary research? I think most people wouldn't like to say that it is, but on the other hand, if other things are equal, they are really high-level science, and one is interdisciplinary and one is disciplinary. Why wouldn't we value more this interdisciplinary, which is if it's broader, if it's more integrative, if it's more capable to transform the existing level of knowledge? So maybe it's more valuable. And also, we should think how much interdisciplinarity is needed in relation to disciplinary research. We already have a 40% of basic research being interdisciplinary one way or another. Is that enough, or how much should there be it? And to what extent should this interdisciplinarity be institutionalized? Because there may be the problem that if it's very strongly institutionalized as a discipline, it may follow the kind of same pattern than disciplines, that it's going to be inward-looking and not so open and flexible to other things. So it will lose something of its kind of heterogeneous identity. And also an important question is how to strike the right kind of balance between the self-organization of science on one hand and the top-down management of science. Because somehow the system should be steered, I think, but where is the boundary that is still useful and which allows room for science to also self-organize. And I would also remind us to think about the unintended consequences of the growing demand of interdisciplinarity, like this phenomenon that researchers are trying to profile themselves in more disciplinary terms in order to sell their expertise to the broad interdisciplinary consortiums and show to the outside world that we have such a variety of different disciplines. Yeah, I think my time is out, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, we do have time for questions. We've rushed you a little bit, I suppose, but we still have roughly a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, depending on how many burning questions you have. So I open the floor, and we have Roderick to start with. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katri. I've got a question of clarification. On one of the slides just before the end, you said interrelations between disciplines are worth designing. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was talking about projects or some kind of entities that last some like 4-year period. So I think it's useful not just to design the research problem and the methods, but also look at explicitly about what are the contributions of different disciplines and understand that they are kind of their own systems of knowledge production, and they can contribute in different ways. And this kind of designing means that it's laid out somehow to the whole group that what is the structure, what's the architecture of the project. And it's just very practical. So something like that.
You're talking about project organization.
Yeah, but not just organizing the people and the resources, the kind of money, but also the conceptual resources, so to say.
Okay. Yeah, Dominic?
Hi, Dominic Stead from Delft University. Thank you for a very clear, illuminating presentation, not least because I'm a research evaluator for the Academy of Finland, so it's given me a bit of an idea about some of the things which are important in the research program. I had a couple of questions related to your presentation. The first one is about the statistic you gave about 40% of the research that you fund is interdisciplinary. The question there is, to what extent is that related to the requirement to be interdisciplinary or to show some interdisciplinary approach, or to what extent is it just about a choice that's made by researchers to adopt that approach? The second question relates to your comment about the systematic effects. The notion that if you have changes to research funding, then that has implications for different beneficiaries, different disciplines, and so on. I'd like to know your opinion on whether this is a zero-sum game. In other words, does it just have benefits for one and disbenefits for others in a similar proportion, or are there some kind of optimal arrangements or some kind of ideal kind of directions that things should be going in that respect?
Yeah. Well, as for the first question about the numbers, how much was interdisciplinary, that was from the funding instrument that has no requirements at all about interdisciplinarity. So the only purpose of that instrument is to fund high quality, original scientific research, and there is no mention about interdisciplinarity. So I would think it's a good sign that it just comes there because researchers, because it's part of the basic stuff that people do. And for the second question, I really much would like to say that there is an optimal solution for distributing the resources, but at least we should kind of analyze the situation, whether what might be the consequences for putting more money like for interdisciplinary research, for example, or being more strategic in terms of which disciplines get money in which years. But I can't, of course, say what would be the optimal, but that's a kind of very good question, and I would hope to be able to focus resources on studying that, to say something for that.
Yeah, Steve.
Sorry, just for clarification, you're referring to the 14% for interdisciplinary research. Is that 14% of projects or 14% of the actual funding amount?
I think the numbers refer to funding.
So 14% of the total amount of money allocated?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
I had a question if nobody else has. Well, while someone else thinks of one. My question, Katri, was I was curious if you could say something more. When you listed the modes of funding, the first one was integrative synthetic mode, and I think you made the comment that whilst a significant amount of projects may be designed in that mode, the delivery and the result doesn't quite meet or live up to the standards. And that struck a particular chord with my experience, because especially with European funded projects, large consortium, and this structure of work packages, which Roderick, you were not here, but this morning Roderick made the point that this idea that we need to structure our funding in work packages in itself potentially creates a barrier already. And in my experience, it's been that indeed, whilst they were designed as integrative synthetic mode, probably it just doesn't really deliver. So I just wondered whether you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, in that particular case, there were only 3 large programs that I studied, so only one was really close to this integrative synthetic mode, and maybe the problem is that it's hard to design. When you go to designing the relationships, it easily goes to a hierarchical or kind of something else. They are not so good. People just kind of assume that this is going to integrate everything, but they don't have the plan on the paper. And the problem is also that it cannot be planned completely. I mean, integration, because it's so difficult to anticipate exactly what path the research is going to take, and it's more kind of easy to design this hierarchical subordination, that there are clear working packages, but how to design real integration, I don't know.
That's interesting, because it raises the point that Roderick was trying to raise for us this morning and challenge us. It's all, at the end of the day, then we have to say something about how to proceed in this direction. But you seem to be telling us, actually there isn't an easy design set of, shall I use the hard word, tools that we can pick out, or at least nobody's designed this. Yes, Albina.
Certainly, quite an idea. Do you apply a different approach among the project, program, and all these specific program for centers and for universities, bearing in mind the weight of criteria?
Well, I was really kind of comparing apples and oranges here, so I hope that I could at some point look a more systematic comparison and somehow take these sizes and at the levels of interdisciplinarity into account and still kind of say something about it, but they were not really comparable here. I just tried to learn something about each case.
The problem is, do you apply each time to all of these instruments criteria for assessment of IDR?
I don't
Do you apply for all these instruments for university, for centers of excellence, also project, also program, assessment, especially of interdisciplinarity, like a criteria? Or from time to time you just neglect this? For centers of excellence, I'm absolutely sure because I saw your methodology for assessment. I'm not sure concerning the university program.
Yeah, well, that's
Okay,
really starting point of study. Yeah, well, my main point is that I use different ways of approaching the interdisciplinarity. The point was just to learn about interdisciplinarity in different kinds of situations. So I wasn't systematic between the schemes.
Yes.
Okay. Actually, put on the slide on your functional definition of we are talking about what we are talking about. Functional definition of interdisciplinarity. I wasn't quite sure about the details. Right. So ID is a means of advancing knowledge beyond the discipline. A couple of questions about that. So, this seems to be suggesting that ID cannot have any non-epistemic goals, such as both intra-academic and extra-academic goals that would not be epistemic, would not be matters of knowledge, would be something non-epistemic, pragmatic goals of all kind. And I would imagine that ID does a great deal of those non-epistemic goals, but they would be not part of your functional definition, even though they would be part of the functions of ID.
Because I'm talking about advancing knowledge, or why you think that the applied aspects would not be involved?
Not just the applied aspects, but ID might be a matter of playing academic power games. It's like
okay, right.
Transposition in the
Well, the function
academic structure.
Yeah, I was focusing
All
here
kinds
on.
of things that
Sure,
you can
yeah.
imagine, and those would not be epistemic goals.
Right. But my aim was just to try to find the epistemic function. Of course, there are other functions, and the kind of real purpose of doing interdisciplinary might be status game, whatever. But it also, I think, it also has this epistemic side always, even though it wouldn't be always the kind of deliberate purpose of certain activity. But if you are looking at what interdisciplinarity does to science, so then I would like to find an epistemic kind of functional definition. But there are other functions too.
What about beyond a discipline? What exactly do you mean by that?
What?
Beyond a discipline.
So either the means of advancing knowledge are beyond a discipline, or the knowledge itself is moving beyond a one disciplinary cluster. So there is a movement between, movement across the boundary of a discipline. I don't know.
One last question, John, please. And I'm going to put the lights on before.
Actually, I wanted to ask you a question about, I was very interested in your use of sort of science studies and STS type framework. In other words, role of science in society. But I wonder, doesn't that imply that this is not just about how disciplines interact with each other? Surely the whole burden of STS for almost 100 years has been we want to look at the role of science plays in a larger social context, not just within the academy. And so I was somewhat surprised to see that your whole discussion of interdisciplinarity was inside the just disciplines and interdisciplinary actions. But what about tacit knowledge, lay knowledge, citizen science, extended peer review, post-normal, mode 2, all of those arguments which basically say it's about more than just what's going on in the university. Isn't that consistent with your larger framing of science?
Yeah, I'm not a hardcore STS scholar, but of course those discussions are familiar to me, and I kind of have sometimes contributed to some of those, but these analyses were mostly consultancy type of works for those funding organizations, and I have framed them so that it could be helpful for the basic academic type of work that these organizations do. So
do the funding mechanisms allow for extra trans-academic kinds of engagement and other forms of knowledge? Is that sort of part of the game when interdisciplinary work is funded?
Well, out of the funding schemes that I was analyzing, the HENVI environmental research programs, there is explicitly mentioned that the co-production of knowledge with those extra academic stakeholders is very much valued, and it should be emphasized, and also raising public awareness and so on. But not much of that actually happened in those programs. So it was part of it was explicitly kind of valuable thing, but researchers didn't really do much of that.